In this podcast, I'm going to be talking about all the actions needed to go fishing and how to fish the stuff from the previous part. So let me clarify that. There's a part 1 to this, as the link suggests, and the title of this. There's a part 1 and a part 2. Start with part 1, part 2, part 3. They're in order for a particular reason. So in part 3, which I'm talking about right now, first things first. So you've gotten all your gear. You have your mono, you have your lures, you have your hooks, you have everything. Now you are basically going to thread your. So basically, you're going to take. You should have a set of guides on your rod. Take the line, set up like when you spool on the reel. So basically, just make an initial knot to tie to the reel. So let me actually go over that knot right now. You can use the same knot for everything in this podcast. It's called the uni knot. Pretend this is my finger's the loop. Just basically picture like a little split ring is a good example of what to picture for this. So you have your split ring, or some sort of metal circle or metal pole. You can practice the thing with a rope. Basically, you take a metal circle, like a little split ring, take that mono, and you're going to go through once. So you're going to go through the split ring once, and you're going to lap it so you have two parallel lines. One is called your tag end, the other is called your main line. Main line being the one that obviously goes up to your rod and reel, tag end being the last little end piece that you have. So they're going to be parallel to each other. I'm trying to do this just for those who are listening, just only listening. This is a good way to picture it. Parallel to each other, and you're going to take your tag end, and you're going to use it to make like a half circle with the other line. And when you do that, you're basically you should have your half circle, and then you're going to have a little extra line on top of that. And And then you'll have two parallel lines, you'll have a half circle. And then with that half circle, you're basically going to wrap around the parallel lines inside the half circle until you get 5, 6, 7 wraps in. Usually that's a good number. And then basically have your tag end stick out of the loop, and then you're going to cinch it all down, moisten down a knot. That's important. Regardless of the knot you decide to learn, moisten it down because it just helps finalize that knot. Now, obviously with rope, you don't need to do that. So that knot that I just described is called the uni knot if you want to look into more detailed versions of it. The uni knot, UNI, it's a very standard knot in fishing, and if you want to practice it with something heavier and bigger to work with, the uni knot can work with rope. I have tied paracord and larger, just random chunks of rope. I will use it as a rope knot. It actually works well as a rope knot. I have used it to cinch up hammocks, have sat in those hammocks, and the hammocks hold up nicely. Well, I've done the double connecting version of it, but yeah, uni knot does, with the right heaviness of line, works just fine. And it was meant for fishing, so obviously it's a good fishing knot. So the uni knot in itself is for tying off something. So once you tie off to your spool, you're basically going to trim the tag in as close as you can. Nail cutters are good for that. And you are basically just going to keep a steady amount of tension, have the spool of line facing opposite the way your reel is going to go. So if your reel is going clockwise, like if it's going to spin clockwise in the spinning setup, go to part 2 to get the reference of the gear I'm talking about. If your spinning reel is going clockwise as you reel it, your spool should be sitting to where it undoes it counterclockwise to get the best performance of the line. And if you don't get it first off, you're using a $5 or $2 spool. You're using a dirt cheap spool of line. You're using $1 or $2 of respooling. So basically get that going. And you basically just do that until you're almost to the brim of your spinning reel. And you have a spooled reel. You have line on your reel now. Congratulations. Once you've done that, and that same basic concepts, regardless of what style of gear, spinning gear in particular, but no matter what size spinning gear you're working with, but in this case, it was a lighter gear that I mentioned previously. And on top of that, you're going to be working with On top of that, now you have your line, you're going to thread it through your guides. So those set guides on your rod, basically make sure it goes all the way through all of them. And one thing to be careful of is sometimes the line will loop around the very tip end, and people wonder what happens. If you're not feeling you're doing something right, check the tip of your rod. It is a basic thing and it works. I'll go through that later when you're talking about casting. So, make all the way through your guides. Cool, nice. Now you have line outside of your rod and reel combo that you can work with. Now you're going to take that same uni knot and you're going to apply it to either the lure or the bait rig. So let me actually start off with the lures because they're just the easiest to tie. You just tie once and you're done. So the little hard bait I told you about getting, there should be a split ring on like a hard jerk bait, a twitch bait, top water. There's usually a split ring on the top water. You just tie it off to that. Easy, done. One knot, you're good to go. The next thing you're going to, and by the way, all this stuff I'm talking about is for gear mentioned in the previous example. I'm using the previous example because it works. Next up on top of that, you're going to have your jig head in plastic. On the jig head, there should be a little loop, like a little eyelet. It looks like something out of like a screw eyelet. Right next to the heaviest part, which is called the jig head, or like basically right next to all the lead, you will see a little circle. That is where you just tie off with the same knot you could use for everything on that jig head. Now your jig head is tied off. And the way you use the soft plastic, I'm going to try to describe this verbally for the people who are just listening to the best of my ability. If it sounds like trash, these are basic things that you can find anywhere else. If it does come out sounding horrible, I apologize. These are things that are hard to do. Explain them verbally. So without further ado, you have your jig head tied. Great. Now you take your soft plastic. In this case, your grub. Your grub's tail, the curved piece should be going facing up, and you're basically going to take your jig head's hook, and you're basically going to match the size. You're going to pinch, you're going to mark where the end of that jig head is. So, for example, the jig head basically goes all the way down the body of the grub. If you have a grub in your hands, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It goes all the way down the body, but does not touch the tail. You're basically going to mark where that ends off in the hook, in the bend of the hook, which basically where that hook obviously bends. And you're basically going to make sure it's a nice straight thread. And there you go. You now have a jig head and grub. So that's basically it. Good place to start. And so now you have successfully tied off a jig head. You've successfully rigged up a jig head and grub. You now can tie off a jerk bait. And there's a few other things that I would recommend for the bait gear. Now you have, I'm not going to go into how to thread all different kinds of baits in this podcast because I'm talking about all different kinds of coast. This is a general basic fishing podcast. But I will talk about how to set up your gear. So you're going to basically going to take off about 2 feet. At most you're going to need 2 feet for this. 2 feet of line. You're just going to take off 2 feet of line off the end. So you have that's called your leader. That is called your end line. The next thing you're going to have is you're going to take your egg sinker. I told you about getting the little sinkers, 1/2 ounce size. You're going to take one and you're going to just throw it up your main line. You're going to take that uni knot. You're going to tie off one of the ends of that barrel swivel that I told you about in the previous podcast. Tie it off. Good to go. Next off, you're going to take your leader. Do the same thing on the other end of the swivel. So basically, you're going to have main line, uni knot, egg sinker right there, swivel, another uni knot. That starts off your leader. And then you're going to take your hook, tie off a uni knot as well. Because just one knot just to get you going basics with that size 4 hook. That is called a Carolina rig, or it's a rudimentary version of a Carolina rig. Other people add beads to protect knots. Other people add all kinds of other fancy pieces. Some people, like in the north, like Northern California, like Northwest, call it a slider rig, which is essentially a slider rig is a more advanced version of this. But closest thing to B2 is like a bait version of a Carolina rig. So that is one rig. The other rig is just literally take your egg sinker, slide up like you would with the main line, and just tie your hook off. That is called a slider rig in California. In Southern California, that is referred to as a slider rig, and both can be fished the same way. Only difference is that leader is a little more touchy. You have a little more extra line to work with. It just works better if you want to go a little more fancy. If you don't want to tie all those knots, you can literally take an egg sinker, throw it up, tie off your hook. If it fits just fine, good to go. That being said, now you have two different rigs to fish bait with on the bottom. Nice. Once you have done that, basically thread on the bait according to whatever you're going to do. If it's a piece of cut bait, it doesn't need rocket science to thread it on. And I'm assuming you're going to be using cut bait because it's just the easiest stuff to go buy at the store. I'm just going off that assumption. So you take your piece of cut bait, thread it on a couple times. I don't care how. And now you're ready to fish off the shore. You just gotta learn how to make a cast. So now I'm actually gonna go bait fishing first in terms of techniques, and then I'm gonna go to lures because easiest to hardest. So first things first, once you throw on your bait, you're then going to make your cast. A basic overhead cast is you're basically going to have the rig is you're basically going to treat it like a catapult. Catapult starts off probably at like a 10 o'clock if you're picture like a clock in your head. About a 9:30, 10 o'clock, slings over, and at 2 o'clock it releases. An overhead cast is the same way in its basic principle. Only difference though is just if you're fishing an open park, if you're fishing relatively open water, I would literally just pay attention to my rig the entire time. That's proper etiquette on sport boats, and I would say the same thing at a public park, especially if you're just getting into fishing. Watch your rig just so you don't accidentally hit anything behind you, be it tree, person, etc. Last thing you want to do is hit another person while they're at the park too. So, watch your rig, go to your 2 o'clock, release. And all I mean by release is you basically knob, you'll see a little knob on your spinning reel. Your finger's just going to, as you're holding the rod, your finger is basically going to grab that little bit of line, open the bail, go behind you, and as you go to about 2:30, you're going to release that finger, and it will just casually shoot out. Now, with a half ounce, it's pretty easy to make a decent cast. Only thing I'd say, though, is with a half ounce sinker, or with better distance on your cast, follow your line out if you can. What I mean by that is your line is, say, at a 2 o'clock. Make sure your rod is at that same 2 o'clock. So that way there's as little resistance on the rod as possible to give yourself a better cast. More free room to work with, for example, so to speak. So your baits hit the water. Great, you've gotten that far. Your baits hit the water. Now your whole rig's just going to sink down to the bottom, give it a few seconds, a little bit of spare line. Now all I'm going to do I'm assuming you don't have a bait runner reel, so I'm going to have you hold on to the rod and just put a little bit of slack in it. For a few different reasons I do this in bait fishing. One, if you're fishing bait, things will have no problem holding on to the bait for a good amount of time and will move with it. Lures, not necessarily, and we'll go over that later. But with bait, a lot of time a fish will take it, will hold on to it for a few moments, and will move around with it. So a little bit of slack is totally fine. You don't need to feel for every little bite. And also, it's more natural in the fish, giving him a few feet of just no resistance on the rod, just to hold on to it, makes it more natural bite. And also, it'll be a good strike indicator. If it goes from slack to tight, even in wind, you know exactly what happened. The fish took it, the fish ate it, and the fish took it. And that's the other thing. In wind, a lot of time, half ounce might not suffice, but if you're using it on slack, it doesn't matter because for sure it's been set on the bottom. Hey, Paul, how you doing? And with that in mind, once your baits hit the bottom, you basically waiting for it and just wait for something to pick it up. Same thing with both rigs, especially with a slider rig, just because you need a little bit of slack for your bait to drift out and give you some difference of line between your egg sinker and yours a piece of cut bait, whatever, and your hook, whatever that may be for you. And on top of that, let me think about this for a second. On top of that, what we were working with is, so now you've done your bait fishing, you've mastered how to fish bait. Great. Next up, you're going to work with your lures. So first off, grub and jig head. You've rigged it up nicely. You make that same cast out there. Now, when it hits the water, you actually have to put effort into fishing a lure. That is why they are lures. They are not pieces of bait. Lures actually imply that you have to move them to some degree. Sometimes it's not a whole lot of movement, but other times it is. So that's why sometimes lures are great if you have short attention spans, because you can constantly work with it. With a grub, there is two key basic ways to fish it, and that's why I have a grub and jig head on this podcast. You can just do a steady reel, and what will happen is the grub will move in the middle of the water, and then that's one way of doing it. And if you're fishing fish that live in the middle of the water or near cover pieces, that's a great way of fishing for them. You could drop that rig. You could drop the jig head and grub down to the bottom. Is the second way. Hits bottom, and you're basically just going to lift your rod up a little bit, bring it back down, lift your rod up, and all it does is bouncing off the bottom. You can also drag it. So basically, you're gonna take your rod, sweep, reel, sweep, reel, sweep, reel. If you're just listening to this afterward, just look up how to fish a Carolina rig. They talk about it the same way: sweep and reel. And that's essentially just your bait just going along the bottom. When that is done, so you learn how to fish your grub, you learn how to fish your cut bait rigs. Great. Well, live bait if you have live bait too, same rigs. That now your next up piece is going to be your lures, or no, your hard baits. Excuse me. We already covered grubs. So with your grubs, what is going to happen? Excuse me, no, not grubs. The hard jerk bait in this case, the hard bait of whatever sort, the subsurface hard bait. The reason why I go to my swipers versus gulpers, I'm pretty sure it's in the link below. Swipers versus gulpers podcast I did a little while ago, and there was a very good reason why I made that differentiation. With some fish are swipers, meaning they want a bait that has two treble hooks, a little bit flashy. They come up and they hit it really quickly, subsurface. And that's where your hard jerk bait comes in. Not every hook set's going to be a clean, nice corner of the mouth hook set. That is the honest truth. Any angler who's been around here for more than a month, leave a comment for everyone else saying, not every hook set is going to be a beautiful, clean corner of the mouth hook set. We all know what this is going. Sometimes you get one treble hook in the mouth. Sometimes you get one treble hook right above the mouth. Belly sometimes, because they're not thinking straight. They're literally just hitting it. So you want a bait with two treble hooks, snagging, kind of. It's kind of snagging. To take that bait. And yeah, so have both. And the way I fish that hard bait is you make your cast out, same cast. And then what you're going to do is your bait hits the water with a hard bait with a lip. So if you have a jerk bait that has a lip on it, I don't have one with me right now, but if your jerk bait has a lip on it, then you're essentially going to just reel it a little bit just to get it to dive down the water, because that lip acts as resistance, moves the bait under the water a little bit, put a little bit of slack in it, and you just do twitches with the rod, and your bait's going to do this. It's going to dart all over the place. Pretend it's my jerk bait. Dart, 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 dart. I don't know what this is actually, but I just found it. So dart, 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 dart. Great. Now it's done that. It's making its darts, and that triggers a bite. Sometimes you could just do like a reel. So like just straight reel can technically work with a lip bait. Couple winds, pause, couple winds, pause, couple winds, pause is another great retrieve. Couple different ideas. or just play around with those different options. Speeds, how often you do it, experiment. At that point, if you know the basics of a jerk bait, just experiment. Now you've done that. So now you've learned how to fish all your lures. You've learned how to fish your bait. And now you get bit. Regardless of how you get bit, you found the bite. So you know the fish is on there. What do? Now with the jerk bait, you could just let him reel into him and just let him just snag himself, essentially. But with the single hook baits, like your jig head and your cut baits, basically what you're going to do is you're going to let him eat it for 1 or 2 seconds, and then make sure you have a tight line, and there's something called setting the hook. All setting the hook is you let your rod go down a little bit to say about you're 12 o'clock, straight out is 3 o'clock in front of you, about a 3:30, 4 o'clock, and you're going to bring it up to about a 1 o'clock is a nice standard of a hook set, and you can vary with that hook set depending on how hard you actually need to set it. But for the open hooks that we're using, 3:30, 4 o'clock to about 2, 1 o'clock, you don't need that much power in the hook set. And obviously hook set will vary depending on how heavy your gear is, what you're working with, how deep down. But for the basics, it's a sweep with a J hook from a 3:30, 4 o'clock position going up to a 2 or 1 o'clock position. That quick snap is what drives the hook. And now you've had that fish. Great. Most fish that you encounter on these lighter, smaller techniques are going to be fish you could reel straight in. You could just go, yay, I caught a fish. But you will know when you have a fish that's going above and beyond. This is when you've set your drag right and you feel that drag peeling out, or you start seeing line go off your reel with resistance. That is called a fish taking drag. That is where it gets really exciting. That means you have a good fish for the size tackle you're using. It could be a 3 or 4 pound trout on 2 pound test. It can be for some people, it's a 60 pound tarpon on 20 pound test, and that tarpon is taking them for a ride. For myself, I have hooked 20 pound guitar fish on 10 pound tests, basically an alpha that I'm describing here. And that thing would go on for 20, 30, 40 feet. So before I could start fighting it. And when you do have a fish like that, you're basically going to lift up the rod and reel it on the way down. So what you're doing is, as the fish is tired and he's not taking way more line, you're slowly moving him. You're bringing him back. You're picking up that line. Slow movement, pick up the line. Slow lift, wind, lift, wind. If you want a reference to on YouTube, just how to fight a fish is basically it. Some people will cut the spool. If you're not comfortable with when a fish is going to take a run, you can't tell, do not cup a spool for extra pressure. Set the drag before your trip and trust your drag. I've done that multiple times and I've succeeded multiple times. Only when you are comfortable with the gear you're with and you know when that fish is going to run, when you've learned to fish the gear much more or much better, then I would feel comfortable with you grabbing, like cupping the spool, which is basically putting your hand to pull a little more pressure on it. Don't do it if you're not if you don't know your gear that well. Don't do it. Is the good rule of thumb. And then on top of that, now you have the fish shore side, both side, depending on what you're doing. You have the fish right next to you. Great. Some people, and now the great different schools of how to land your fish, which is the last part of this podcast. How do you land your fish? On a smaller fish, 1 or 2 pounds on 10 pound test. Anything more than that, and I would be too afraid. Your line would just break. Anything more than that, do not pick it up by the line, because your 10 pound test is meant for resistance. It is not meant as just sheer pulling power. It is not meant to be a deadlifting tool. So do not, if your thing looks to be more than 3 pounds or 2 pounds, do not deadlift it. There are other techniques. And also, you can high stick a rod, meaning you let your fish out of the water, your rod's sagging a lot, and your rod can break doing that. That is called high sticking a rod, and that's how you break rods. I have done it. it is horrifying because then you don't have your rod the entire day. You're on a boat and you go, oh no, I am down a rod because of it. My rod is sitting in the trash. So, do not high stick a rod. Do not, if the fish looks too big to pull up just by the line, do not do that. And then on top of that, you're basically going to work. So there's a couple different ways of doing it. One, but you don't do it for very long, and it's a creature habit for a lot of people. You just do a quick lift up. So basically, you're essentially swinging the fish onto the bank or onto the boat. It's not safe practice to do this because the slime coat can rub off on the fish, and it's not good for the fish if you're doing catch and release. But if you're catching and keeping, totally fine. Other one is if the fish doesn't have sharp teeth. So, like, take a largemouth bass. It's a classic example of this. You can basically get down there and you can lip him, and you can bring him up that way. So now you have the fish held upright, done. But you don't want to do it with a pike or a barracuda because you're going to your thumb after the trip's going to end up in the ER room. Spoilers. Please do not do that with the sharp tooth fish like a halibut or barracuda. Please don't. Please, people. Some of you might be daredevils to go do it, but please don't. If the fish looks like it has sharp teeth, assume it has sharp teeth. If you don't know any better. Although that being said, sharp teeth. When it comes to grabbing your fish, however you end up trying to land this thing, spines. I will clarify this. Sometimes you think you're going to try to hold the fish by just gripping it. A lot of fish will have spines sticking out of them. Largemouth being one, bluegill being another, and there's many other examples down the line. And with that, there's a proper way to hold a fish that has spines. You can pretty much tell on top of it, on its dorsal fin, which is the fin on top of the fish, you'll see things that look pokey. Do not touch them. With some fish, they're even venomous. So just, if you know in advance that it's venomous, if you don't know in advance that it's venomous, assume it is, just because logic. But basically, you're just going to take your hand and you're going to start from the head down. It will fold down all the fins. Some fish, like catfish, you can't do that with. Like hardheads on the Gulf, you can't fold down the spines. Lipping them works just fine. I've done that with channel catfish, though the teeth are a bit rough. Guys noodle for them, so you can definitely lip a catfish. If you're fishing for them with your bare hands, yeah, you could definitely fish for them. You grip them when you're landing them. And yeah, that's basically it. Now you've landed your fish, hold it out of the water for maybe 30 seconds, a minute before you release it, or you could just proper preservation of keeping it. Cooler bag. You don't need anything fancy, depending on how long you're going to be out there for. And with that in mind, that is everything from tying knots to how to land your fish in one podcast, one big fat run. That is all, folks. You have now learned how to go fishing with a good example. Done. Nice. With that being said, do not hold your fish out of the water for too long. Take your picture. All's good. And release your fish. Sometimes you do a light throw. Or you could just go down to the water, basically let him revive him a little bit. But that is it. Now you've released your fish. Or you've kept it, depending on what you do. If you like this series, let me know. Like, subscribe, comment. Now, comment. This was a scenario for open water, saltwater, as I mentioned in the previous podcast. What are some, like, ponds, lakes, Bay Area scenarios that you guys have near your houses? Let me know in the comments. Fun little prompt to work with. And take care, guys.